to introduce Rick Kern. Professor Kern is the director of Berkeley Language Center and is a professor of the French department at the University of California, Berkeley. He teaches courses in French linguistics, applied linguistics, and foreign language pedagogy. His research interests include second language acquisition, psycholinguistics, reading, writing, and technology. He is an associate editor of the journal Language, Learning, and Technology, which is perhaps the top journal for technology and learning, technology and language learning, and has just released a book for Cambridge University Press entitled Language, Literacy, and Technology, and is currently co-editing a book on screens and representations in video conferencing. So please help me welcome Dr. Kern.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you and Owner for having invited me to this conference. It's great to be here. So, is this not, do I have to switch it on?
You have to switch it on.
How do I switch on the on? Oh, is it on the box here? Oh, right on top, okay. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Is that better?
Okay, good. Anyway, I was just thanking Dave and Owner for welcoming me here to this conference. It's great to be here with you. So what I'm going to do is follow up a little bit on Binden's talk, because one of the things that she pointed out in her talk that I thought was very interesting was how environments, as teachers move to online environments, their teaching changes. Things that they are used to preparing classes in one way when, as she told us, the teachers figure they can just have an outline and then go into class, a face-to-face class, but with the online they have to prepare every minute ahead of time. And that's going to be one of the points of my talk today, is that as we move from one environment to the next, those changes make a big difference in how we go about teaching. So what I'm going to try and do today is provide a very broad framework. This is not going to be a 50 tips for Monday morning type presentation. This is going to be more of a broad thinking exercise where we can sort of develop some metaphors that might be useful as we develop online materials and think about teaching in different environments. So one of the points I want to make today is that communicative language teaching is a model that we have to rethink and retool, I think, a little bit in the age of technology-mediated communication. And one of the founding tenets of much of the communicative language teaching models is Saussure's model of the two speakers. So you have speaker A, speaker B. Speaker A has a concept, a thought, and puts that into an acoustic image in the mind, which then is articulated, and then speaker B hears that utterance and relates that acoustic image to a concept. And the idea here is that now speaker A and speaker B share the same concept because of the arbitrary sign, which by social convention we take to mean the exact same thing. So when you utter something, it activates the exact same concept in my head. And then when I speak in return, you have similar concepts to mine activated in your head. But we've seen over and over again that when it comes to cross-cultural education, cross-cultural communication, that this activation of the same concept doesn't seem to play out. So one of the, I have to make sure I click on the right thing here because I've got two different buttons to push. So what I'd like to do is take a little example here of, here's the scene. A young man has just accompanied a young woman to her apartment, and he says to her, now here is the utterance, you have a phone here. Okay, so the question is, what does this mean? Well, it is an assertion at least in its form. But pragmatically, it can actually take on various functions. So in the next slide, we'll see a number of scenarios where this can be taken up. Always focused on the same utterance, you have a phone here. Okay, the young man says, you have a phone here. The young woman says, yeah, it's modern. Oh, I wouldn't have imagined. Scenario 2, you have a phone here. Yeah, my number is 0483353609. Oh, so I can call you then. Scenario 3, you have a phone here. Yeah, it's modern. Oh, well, shoot, I was hoping you'd give me your number. Scenario 4, you have a phone here. Yeah, my number is 0483353609. Okay, but I wasn't asking for your number. Okay, now the question is, what does this utterance mean? Well, one of the things that we can see immediately is that what it means is hard to establish by the utterance in isolation. We have to see how it is taken up in the subsequent discourse. And in fact, in all of these examples, it takes 3 utterances at least to stabilize a certain meaning. But it's further complicated by the fact that can we really know what speaker A had in his mind, what his intention was when he uttered, you have a phone here? Now, it may be in scenario 1, for example, that he wanted to know what her phone number was so he could call her. But then she says, yeah, it's modern. And he says, okay, I better accommodate my response to hers because I don't want to come off as being too forward. Okay? Scenarios 3 and 4, there's a kind of correction that takes place where she says something and he has to correct her reading of this statement. So through dialogue, we can stabilize meanings, at least temporarily, because it may be that, a week from now, they come back and say, remember last week when I dropped you off and I talked about the phone? Well, and then it may be that at that point the meaning gets yet reinterpreted again. So the point here is that it's not a simple matter of just communicating a concept in my head to a concept in your head, but there's a lot of dialogue and reframing that takes place in communication. Okay, so let's move to now online communication with some examples. So what's happening with A and B here? Does anyone want to read that?
What's up?
Oh, the fluent? Okay, so what's up? And then with the response?
Not much, how about you?
Not much, how about you? Okay, so this is fluent reading here. Now, but if this were 20 years ago, this would have been a heck of a lot harder to read. So again, the context, the social processes that we've been through that have been mediated by technological platforms have allowed us to be quite fluent readers of this kind of exchange. Now what's interesting here is that we have different symbolic systems being used. So to look at A's utterance, we have was. Now, is it the verb past tense to be? No, that would be W-A-S was. But what's going on here?
What is what?
Right, okay. So, but it is a phonological representation because how do we get to was from what's?
You're lazy.
Okay, okay. But what is the social process through which we can recognize that analogy?
You're slopping through it. Is that what you want?
Well, okay, but there's a certain cultural association too. With hip-hop culture and a certain speech style that, yeah, it's cool to say, hey, what's up? Okay? So there is you're reading culture in here at a phonological level, but then you've got the caret sign. So this is an iconic representation. So now we've shifted from the phonological to the iconic, all in one utterance, bringing multiple sign systems into play with one another and knowing when to switch systems. Because you have to know when to switch to an iconic system after starting off in a phonological system. This is really hard, okay? And then not much how about you is just initialism. So you're taking the first initial of words and then, so there again, that's an entirely different system than we had in A's utterance, which was phonological and iconic. Here we have first initials. Now, that this can happen as fast as you guys read it off is pretty amazing, because at least 3 symbol systems were used, and you got the transition points exactly right. Okay, I got a homeworks now. Now this is a fluent English speaker. Why would, and she's writing to her sister, why would she write, this is in a text message, I got a homeworks now. Why would she write that? She knows how to say, I've got to do my homework now.
Rebellious.
Rebellious? That's not the way she explained it.
It's faster.
But any other ideas? Yeah.
I don't know, maybe it's wrong, but I type stuff like that, but only because I'm not good.
Oh, just because of the limitations of the thumb.
Yeah,
as
like
you-
I'll like accidentally hit an extra button, and I don't reread my text. I don't make sure I don't have spelling errors.
Yeah.
I just hit send. So
Yeah.
I would type something like that on accident.
Okay, and then we have another comment.
I think because of it's being, I think in speaking, if they were just always talking to each other, I don't think that would pop up. But I think because it's written, and the register is a big issue.
Yeah.
You can become more fluent in doing simple, easy things.
Yeah, she's never uttered this in speech.
No.
This doesn't work in speech. Yeah.
Probably Thorne proposed this one. A lot of times when I was to write some words of the Thorne
So the
proposed
phone
some,
actually
and I
proposes,
just
yeah,
followed
yeah,
it.
with that
So I think this one-
autocorrect.
I
Yeah.
think this one.
Well, this wasn't the case of autocorrect here, but that can wreak havoc. Yeah.
Coming from a Turkish background, I would assume the person has more than a lot of homework assignments.
Okay. So,
That's my
yeah.
interpretation.
Well, the point is that we can hypothesize lots of different reasons for this. Now, as it turns out, this was language that she shares with her sister. And so they have certain ways that they talk. And so they do transformations. They make nouns into verbs, and so forth. And so that's what she was explaining now, that this was, so I got a homework. So homeworks was actually a verb for doing homework. So they play with word classes as sisters. And they're fluent English speakers, but they like to play with language. And they both know what the other is trying to get across. But these are not signs that are part of an a priori system that we use in our language. Okay, did you get the orange juice I made for you? Now, does anyone know how to interpret this? Pretty straightforward, right?
Okay.
It would be inappropriate as a text because it's too formal. Yeah, okay. Well, this was a text.
I'm just gonna guess here that it doesn't mean literally made the orange juice,
It does not.
because I ask my husband all the time, would you make me a glass of water? And that drives him crazy because he's not making it. So I'm thinking she's asking, like, just will you get me a glass of, or did you, I gave you a glass of orange juice, not like I literally
Okay.
did it.
All right.
That's my guess.
Great hypothesis, but not on target in that this is asking about drugs.
Oh my God.
So this is,
Yeah.
did you get the weed
Oh my God.
that I left for you? But because parents read text messages, they have a code. And so they switch out orange juice for weed. And they know what that means. But they do it on purpose because the parents don't know the code. All right, so again, we're looking at signs that are used that are not part of an a priori system, but that are very meaningful to individuals in their language use. So what we're going to take for a minute is look at the metaphor of design of meaning. And this is, for those of you who are familiar with the New London group, This was, had their manifesto back in 1996, and has been taken up in a number of publications that you've got on the handout. By the way, there's a handout in the folder there for those of you who haven't seen it. Okay, so in this model, one of the things, and this goes back to Binton's talk, is material resources. The physical environment plays a very important role in the shaping of meaning design. So for example, when we were talking about texting, a lot of the abbreviations that come out is because of the mechanics of testing. You want to do something short, sometimes autocorrect steps in and changes things beyond our intention and so forth. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of how this works out. So you've all seen road, signs. So what's going on here? We've already seen this going on, okay? What have we got here? What are the systems going on here? We have, it's the same thing like was up, but the order is flipped. We have an icon starting off, so icon for the cross, and then we have the phonological component coming after that. Now, what's weird about this? Okay, the order is flipped. And why is that?
Ongoing.
Because the idea here is that we're driving in a car and we're going to encounter ped before we encounter xing. Does that make any sense? Kind of. Moving through space. But every time I read it, I always start with the top and then I read down. So it doesn't really work with me. But the idea is that moving through space, you're going to encounter this word first. And so that's why they always put on a road the first word that you're going to encounter as you move through space. But it has to be short because it's got to be big and it's got to fit within the lane, right? So we have to abbreviate pedestrian, which would never fit across the road. And we have to abbreviate crossing too, because that would be too far. Okay, but now when we see it on a sign, now when it's all in this in a vertical plane, we can put the order as ped xing, the normal order, because we're reading it in a different format. Okay, same thing happens when we see ambulances. This is mirrored because that's right. There's a social design here. The idea here is that this is not meant to be read directly. It's meant to be read in your rear view mirror. And so for it to be an effective message, it has to be written in mirroring. So this is the whole idea of the material dimensions coming into play in the design of meaning. There's also social resources, language, all kinds of semiotic systems come into play as we are designing meaning. So when we have a sign like do not enter, this tells us a linguistic message, but it also has this bar, shows prohibition across the meaning, across the middle there. Now, another part of the model is the individual contribution. Now here we have a reappropriation of this do not enter sign, and now we see it in an entirely new way, where this creepy monster is coming out from this slot in the sign. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is that you will never again see a do not enter sign without some little trace of this being a magic portal where a monster can come out. The fact that you have experienced it leaves some kind of trace. And this is what happens with language too, where people will invent things with language, and it does leave a trace that becomes then a resource for you and for other people who've also experienced that to draw upon. So that's the point here, where we are bringing together material resources, social resources, and individual resources. These are the three poles that provide stability. Just like if you've got 2 legs to a tripod, it's going to be wiggly. But as soon as you provide 3, then you've got a stable system. It's the same thing. You can't have just 2 of these. You have to be taking into account the material, the social, and the individual to explain a lot of meaning as it evolves in use. So the idea here is that this is all very interactive among the material, social, and individual. So let's take a look at an example from Eva Lam. If you're not familiar with her research, she's done fabulous case studies of immigrant Chinese speakers who are learning English. And in this case, Kei Yi, this is a 17-year-old immigrant from the Shanghai area. And she is communicating with a young man named Da Wei. And what's interesting about this is the use of Mandarin together with Cantonese, together with Taishanese, which is a particular dialect related to Cantonese, which requires the use of Roman script in order to replicate the sounds of that, and the use of emoticons. Here, different kinds of emoticons, as you can see. And here, look at the difference between this one and this one. And the idea here is that this is a little perplexed, and this is much more perplexed just by the length of the mouth. So again, an iconic dimension. But what's interesting here is that by using, she is a Mandarin speaker, but by writing in Cantonese, the red here represents, I'm not sure if the red shows up all that well, but the red is Cantonese, and in here, Taishanese. And that they are alternating back and forth, but Da Wei is very impressed with her use of Cantonese. So the idea here is that in terms of identity, projecting an identity and projecting a willingness, a certain empathy, linguistic empathy, this is expressed through language choice. So the design here is very much in function of, first of all, the material environment of a chat room, but also in terms of the social dimension and making lots of individual design choices. Let's take a look just for a moment at Greeklish. So in the early days, when you didn't have world script, Greek alphabet had to rely on ASCII. And so you've got the characters of the ASCII keyboard. And so what they did was they developed, Greeklish is not English. It's just a way of using ASCII. It's basically ASCIIized Greek. But the question came up, well, do we represent this phonetically, or do we represent this graphically? So Athena is what we're trying to represent. But the question is, do you make it look like the Greek letters, or do you make it sound like the way it's pronounced? And here is an email in Greeklish, and you can see that the blue is represented by phonetic representation, the red is graphic, and so this is very highly mixed in Greeklish. And there is no one standard. It's kind of like whatever I feel like at the moment, I will represent Greek in this. What's interesting about this is that even when Unicode came in and everyone could use Greek script, a lot of people kept on writing emails in Greeklish. Why? It was just the way you wrote email. I've got a computer engineering colleague at Berkeley who still writes his emails in Greeklish, even though he's been able to use Greek alphabet for a decade, well, at least a decade now. But he persists because that's the way he's gotten used to doing email. So again, the social convention comes into play after the original invention. Okay, and we can see how this has been in lots of different languages. We all recognize later. Okay, how about 143? I love you. Okay, great. We've got a fluent reader right here. And how do we get I love you? Letters. The number of letters. Okay, very different system that we're using in this than we are here. How about 88? Now this is not English.
Bye-bye.
We need to go to China for this.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so ba, ba, which sounds like bye, bye. So there's an analogy. It's not literally that, but there's an analogy being made. But if we go now to Germany, anyone know what that is? Any German speakers here? This is Heil Hitler. This is the sign used by neo-Nazi groups. 88, because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. Okay, different system. Okay, 8282.
Hurry.
8282?
Hurry, hurry.
Yes, yes. Okay, now how do we get, Sung Young identified that right away. So how do we get hurry, hurry?
Well, it reads Pali Pali.
Pali Pali.
So it's a
Okay, so Pali Pali, so this is an abbreviation used in Korean. Okay, and now this one also in Korean. So this one is,
Angel. Angel.
yes, and so in Korean it's called
Chonsa.
Chonsa. Okay, so this means angel. So and this has been used in songs, in song lyrics too. How about this in Japanese? Do we have any Japanese speakers?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and in Chinese?
Why is it big? Thank you.
Well, okay, why is it thank you?
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, see, this is interesting because it's not a literal phonetic transcription. It is an Asian modified pronunciation. So there's a cultural dimension that goes along with. It's not just a standard, American thank you. Okay? It is inflected culturally by the language origin, but it's tied to English. Okay, same thing in Chinese, san kyu. Okay, this is Italian. Do you have any Italian speakers? Okay, this is the second person singular of the verb essere, to be. And then this is say, and this is sedici. And this can be used for if you say, so say dice. Okay, so this needs to be read in Chinese. Yes, yes, shi shi. And then here, this is a very long-standing tradition of indicating tones with numerals. Okay. Now, how about this one? Do we have any Thai speakers here?
Ha ha.
Okay. We've got ha ha ha. So this is used to indicate laughter. When we go to China,
Crying.
woo woo woo. Crying. Okay. So the same 3 digits have very different meanings as we go to a different cultural system. Okay, so what do we make out of all of this in terms of if we're designing courses, if we're designing instructional materials? So what I'm going to do, let's see, how much time do I have? 20 minutes, okay. I'm not going to go into depth into all of these. I'm just going to pick a few to focus on. But one of the things I think we need to think about is what are the fundamental principles that should guide us as we develop language education programs in various material environments amidst all this change that we're experiencing in electronic formats. So the point I'd like to make is that rather than thinking dualistically in terms of now, the new, and then the old, that we need to really be thinking about how the new relates to the old, because a lot of the things that we're doing now with abbreviations and using numerals and letters together have actually been done for centuries. In fact, ever since the beginning of writing 5,000 years ago, when you go back to cuneiform. So the things that we're doing now are not that new, but we need to have a framework to think about these kinds of things. So these are 5 principles on the left-hand side. This is all on your handout, so you don't need to write any of this down. That I've identified, and this is not to say that these are the 5 principles that people need to keep in mind, but these are just things that have occurred to me and that might be helpful or might be modified in your context. And what I'd like to do is for you to be thinking about your language, your culture, the one that you teach or the ones that you teach, and to be thinking about how you could bring some of these principles to work in your teaching. So we'll start with the first one, that meanings are situated and relational and autonomous. We've seen a number of examples of this, that they're not just a priori, that they have to be constructed and they have to be negotiated among people. So the pedagogical goal is to help develop learners' awareness of how, when you recontextualize a sign, take that 555 that you saw at the end there. You know, when it's in Thailand, it's laughing, and when it's in China, it's crying. So dramatic difference, just a question of the cultural context. So you can do this in any number of ways, but you know, just take a simple word like cafe. You know, where do we encounter cafe? Well, lots of different places. And it's very different whether you see it on a coffee bag or on a building, or, I mean, there are lots of different buildings that you can see, or whether it's a sign, or whether it's a tattoo, or whether it's a billboard. All of these give different meanings to what you mean by cafe. And it is the interaction of the letters C-A-F-E with the environment that makes all the difference. We demonstrate with a very simple symbol like X. So what does this mean? Well, it depends on what domain we're in. So let's hear just some examples off the top of your head. Multiplication, okay.
Signature.
Signature. 10. Roman numeral 10.
Greek
Okay.
fraternity. Greek fraternity.
Greek fraternity. Great.
Crossing.
Christ. Crossing.
Location on the map.
Location. X marks the spot.
Wrong.
Wrong.
Don't go there.
Don't go there.
Or do not enter.
Do not enter. Okay. All right. It's a film. X-rated. Okay. We can go on and on and on. I mean, there's so many things that are tied to this symbol. And the idea is to get students aware of the fact that, you know, and even going to a math context, you said multiplication right off the bat, you know, but then you can say, well, it's also a variable in math, in algebra. So same thing with, you know, what does this mean? Well, there are lots of different types of meaning. So we can talk about the referential meaning. What do these words refer to according to their framing? Or metaphorical meaning. So are they being used literally or metaphorically? And if they're being used metaphorically, to what is the referent being compared? And what's the effect of that comparison? How does the particular ordering of the words communicate something in the structural meaning? How would the meaning be changed if we reordered the words in the utterance? The intertextual meaning. How do these words echo other texts or other words that you've experienced, and what's the importance or the effect of that echoing? The social meaning. What's the relation? What do these words say about the relationship between these characters in the novel, or the people, the speaker and the listener? The personal meaning. What feelings are evoked by these words? The symbolic meaning. You know, beyond the use of metaphors, how do the textual elements used? How are they used in allegorical or symbolic ways? And the ideological meaning. Whose interests are at stake here? Who has something to gain in terms of power relations or the challenging of power relations? So the idea here is that students need to be made always aware of, you know, when they say, what does this mean? That itself has multiple meanings. Okay, second principle, that language literacy and communication rely on both convention and invention. So this is the interesting paradox, is that in order to innovate, in order to invent, we have to draw on pre-existing material. We have to use resources. But we don't have those pre-existing resources without some original invention in the first place. So there's always this give and take, and that when we communicate, in a sense, we're always inventing in some minor way. But in order to do that, we have to draw upon conventional resources. And the kids do this all the time when they're learning their native language. So my older daughter, when she was when she was just very little, she would point to something and say, habit, habit, habit. And that was, I want milk, I want toy, I want doggy, but it was just habit, habit, habit. So the same formula, but using her finger to point to referent, and that worked really well. When she was older, she said, it's really bad to pollutionate. So here you have a perfectly understandable utterance, but one that is not part of the convention. When we came to school visits, she stood up in front of the class and she said, I'm now going to introduct you to my parents. Okay, so taking her knowledge of introduction, making a verb out of it, makes perfect sense, but it's not part of the system. But we do this all the time with language. We're constantly using little bits and pieces of resources that we have to do new things. So one of the things that we want to get students to do is to reflect on these conventions through journals, through class discussions. We also want them to get used to using and adapting conventions in their language classrooms. The third principle is the medium matters. And this is going back to Vindman's talk, how teachers became different entities and behaved differently in online environments than they did in face-to-face classrooms. So the idea here is that we want to get students to be thinking about how the material context that they use affect how they design meaning and possibly how these ways of doing things change over time. So for example, thinking about handwriting and the importance of handwriting. So for example, in the 19th century, the script that you use told a lot about your social class. And so just by glancing at a letter, people could tell your gender and they could tell your social class without even reading a word, but just by looking at the handwriting. So, handwriting communicates a lot about us. Nowadays, it's all text. So all of that individual variation is washed out in that particular way. But people introduce individual variation in other ways that are consistent with the texting medium. So the idea the importance of presenting or projecting one's chosen identity is still there, but the particular ways that we may do it may have to change as we move from one medium to another. Same thing by analogy, that when we're teaching in a video conferencing environment versus a chat room environment versus a blog environment, all of these are going to make us to be different people in a sense, to do things differently. And so we have to be aware of and ideally talk to our students about the specific kinds of adaptations that they and we go through as we move from one environment to the next. Okay, so reflecting on language forms and their material contexts, and reflecting on relations between past and present technologies and literacy, and then reflecting on the relations between mediums, social practices, and ideologies. And I want to just take a moment on this one to be thinking about the ideological component, because we don't often think about that. But so for example, if I start Chinese tomorrow, one of the first things that I'm going to be asked is, at least at Berkeley, they give students the choice. They say, do you want to work with traditional characters or do you want to work with simplified characters? And so, I don't know, simplified sounds good because it's simple, right? But this is a political, I'm being asked a political question. I'm not aware of that. As a learner, I'm just being asked which script do I want to learn as I'm using my book. But I don't know that, simplified characters were developed, to spread literacy in the People's Republic of China, and that, there was resistance to this in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, where they retain the traditional characters. So if I choose one or another, I'm in a sense siding with particular groups. I had no idea, but I think this is the kind of thing that where there has to be some kind of awareness of what does it mean to use simplified versus traditional characters. When we think about, there's a folder back there about Urdu. So Hindi and Urdu are very similar at the level of speech. But when it comes to writing, they can be very distinct because there are two different writing systems that can be used. There's the Nastaliq, which is derived from Arabic and is used by Muslims. And then the Devanagari is used by Hindus. And so even though your spoken language may not identify you with a particular group, when you pick up a pen and you start writing, you have no way of hiding your religious affiliation. And so there's a commitment there when you pick up a pen. So this is some more socio-political baggage that goes along with the design of meaning, and that people are bound to this. Arabic and Chinese, one writing system that covers huge spans of linguistic diversity, all one system. It seems like there's great homogeneity in the language because there's homogeneity in the writing system. But it couldn't be farther from the truth. Many of those spoken varieties are mutually incomprehensible. And then when it comes to colonized peoples, well, most of them end up using the writing system of their colonizers, or if not the language of their colonizers. These are all things that come into play that language learners often unwittingly come to face. So these are things that I think we should be thinking about as bringing to explicit knowledge. Okay, and texts and communication are always multimodal. The whole idea about multimodal being technologically driven is kind of a myth in the sense that face-to-face communication, I mean, nothing could be more multimodal. We've got every sense being used, from sight to touch to hearing to smell and so forth. So this is kind of, face-to-face is kind of the ultimate in multimodal communication. But the whole thing is to think about what are the multi-modes being brought into play in various contexts as we move from one environment to the next. So getting students to reflect on the interaction between linguistic and non-linguistic elements, because there's so much that gets communicated by the non-linguistic that we often don't pay attention to in the language classroom. Developing rhetorical skills in a range of modes. And this is where on your handout, just as one example, if you are in a filmic context, camera angle is one thing that has a huge impact on the meanings that are created in film. And so this, you've got a rundown of different ways that film can be used. And in writing, different ways we can think about the non-linguistic dimensions. And then developing awareness of how coding and how digital environments work. And also thinking about the ethical dimensions of this. So for example, if we want to make a space anonymous where people are contributing anonymously, well, if this is a small local group, that's not going to be an issue. That'll probably encourage lots of participation. But when it becomes a massive environment that is where there's anonymity, it often gives rise to cyberbullying, where people let their guard down and just say anything, no matter how hurtful, because they know that their identity is not being tracked. So there's a question about, what do we design for what scale? On a small scale, works great. On a large scale, may not be as productive as we hope. And then the fifth principle, language technologies and text mediate between the social and the individual, between ourselves and imagined worlds. So here the point is to think about the interface between society and ourselves, going back to those early examples of language play, creating a certain identity through one's language use. These are all things that require the use of social conventions, but the key is to twist or reframe or reappropriate those conventions in novel ways. And some of the ways we want to get students thinking about this is thinking about all the different ways that mediation impacts their learning. So for example, using a textbook, using a blog, using a chat room. What are the ways in which they learn differently in these environments? How do they learn differently in a lecture than they do from a book? All of these different mediums have different power relations, and this is why a lot of people talk about the more democratic communication in online environments, because you destabilize the power relation that exists with the teacher in front of, a classroom who's standing and the students are sitting and so on and so forth. Authenticity. Does anyone recognize this image here?
Octopus?
Yes, this is the Northwest tree octopus. Did you know about that? The Northwest tree octopus was the subject of a study by Don Liu at the University of Connecticut. And so the students looked at the online information about the Northwest tree octopus. And they learned all kinds of interesting facts. Does the Northwest tree octopus exist?
No.
No. Most of the students who are quite sophisticated computer users, because of the extent of the network of information about the Northwest tree octopus, came to believe that it did exist. Moreover, when they were told explicitly that it actually doesn't exist, they wouldn't believe it. They said, I think it does exist.
I think that octopus's tentacles got to it.
So here you have the power of finding information online and having that, even when you're told this is all a bluff. Some of the students persisted. These were high school students, 7th and 8th grade. So, they've still got ways to go in their development, but it is surprising that even when told that it was a fabrication, that they still believe, some of them still believe that these existed. But there are other analogous ways that are more subtle. So for example, in textbooks, how are historical events talked about? So Kimberly Vinnell, in the reference that you've got in the handout, does a great article on the Spanish conquest in Latin America, and how her Spanish textbook presents the conquest of the native population in Latin America, and the use of images, the use of language, and it does a very interesting set of lessons based on the reframing of those uses of language. So this is not just a question of Northwest tree octopuses, but historical events that appear in textbooks and whose voice is dominant in those presentations. And then finally, recognizing how people create social identities. And again, coming back to different ways of, for example, handwriting a message versus calling someone up on the phone versus doing an email. These all have different projections of what we want to convey just by virtue of the medium itself, and that these create particular social identities in particular contexts. And then finally, acknowledging the aesthetic dimensions of communication that we often neglect until we get to literature seminars where we're focused on particular aesthetic uses of language. But in fact, from day one of any language, aesthetics can come into play in a very important way. In fact, that's often how students relate to new languages, is through the very aesthetic appreciation of what they see in the language. Okay, so on the handout there, you've got some heuristic questions that can be thought of. You know, we're typically focused on the thingness of language. So we often think in terms of teaching vocabulary, teaching grammar rules as things, as objects. And the point I'm trying to make here is that it's really the in-betweenness that we need to also pay attention to. We obviously need to teach those things, but what's just as important is the in-between and those relations that connect the items, because as we've seen, the relations often bear as much meaning as the things themselves. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that one of the things that we need to be thinking about, I think, is sensitizing our students to the particular ways that the different media that they use, whether it is texting on their phone, whether it is talking on the telephone, whether it is talking face-to-face, whether it is talking face-to-face with their teacher versus their father versus their girlfriend versus their little brother, all of these relations have a huge impact on how they use language. And that by designing language curricula and language materials that show, that allow us to juxtapose different uses of language, we will heighten students' awareness of those and better prepare them for the technologies of tomorrow. Because there's no way we can predict what those technologies will be right now. That's a very inexact science. But what we can do is give them a certain predisposition towards language and communication, where they will be sensitive to thinking about how new technologies that come along, long after we've left, will put them in the same basic communicational situation of having to think about, how do I express my identity, how do I express my feelings in a medium in a way that is socially appropriate and that is expressing my own identity as an individual. So that's the gist here, to be thinking sort of broadly about how to apply these principles with whatever technology may lie ahead. So I will end there, and thank you very much.
Okay, we have 10 minutes to ask questions, but we want you to text them directly to Dr. Kern in the correct cultural context. No, please, if you have questions, we'd like to have them now. I think you stumped the panel.
So, I remember a couple of years ago having a conversation about whether or not to use truly authentic language in text message examples or good modeling authentic language in text examples. And I think we can all agree that that would probably be a very contentious discussion, and it was. And I think most of the language teachers decided that good modeling was, in their mind, more authentic language than the actual authentic language. So if the question was asked to you, we are designing a language course, and we use text messages as examples of authentic language, but we use good modeled language, not authentic. So what do you think? Should we be using authentic text message language in DARI instead of our nicely modeled DARI language that we currently use?
Well, first of all, the notion of authenticity is somewhat vexed because these are both authentic. And the good modeling is very authentic pedagogical material. I mean, we're used to using pedagogical material, which is authentic for pedagogy, but it's not necessarily authentic in the real world out there. So, I mean, I think that there's an element of both. You know, obviously, they need to see models of language use, models of genres, to get some grip on what it means to, you know, whatever it is, write a cover letter, write a CV, because those vary dramatically from culture to culture. So for example, in France, if you're applying for a job, if you type your cover letter, it usually gets thrown out immediately because you must be hiding something. Because many French companies will submit their cover letters to a graphologist who they hire to analyze your handwriting. So, you know, there are, and every culture has got its own takes on different genres. So yeah, you have to have models because it may be very, very different from what you're used to. On the other hand, you also want to be able to work out what real language that is not modeled for you as a learner is going to look like, sound like, and to see how well you can strategize. You know, what kind of strategies can you develop for making sense of that language, which is going to be probably more difficult. Because if you look at those examples that we had at the beginning, for a language learning, that's really impenetrable. There's so many stages that you need to go through in order to get at what is, you know, shown on the screen there, that they don't have that cultural background, much less the linguistic background. So it's pretty impenetrable. So they may need to be shown step by step what's going on there. So I guess there, it's a different kind of modeling. It's not the language that is modeling for the students, but it's the process being modeled by the instructor who can say, okay, I know you can't make any sense of this right now, probably, but let's walk through the steps that will allow you to make some sense of it, you know, to fill in all those silences that need to be filled in if it's going to be meaningful. So I would say it's probably both. That there's an element of both involved. Yeah.
I really liked the list of the heuristics for talking about these kinds of issues. And I'm wondering, even for somebody with a background in discourse analysis and semiotics and applied linguistics, these are really difficult things to think about, to talk about with students. What would your advice be for instructors that don't have that kind of background for leading these types of discussions with their students?
Well, just as I think students should be, you know, thinking about some of these issues, I think teachers should be too, and it should be part of teacher education. So that, I mean, I think there are changes that ought to be made in the ways that teachers are prepared to deal with language, not just as models of normative language use that are enshrined in textbooks, but to be looking at discourse and to be looking at the complexities of how people make and take meanings in social contexts that involve partly language, but also other elements as well. And so, you know, I think that it's a challenge for our institutions of teacher education, but I would say that's something that we need to attend to fundamentally, is to get teachers themselves more aware of how complex and how fascinating, you know, some of these things, some of these connections are that have not heretofore been part of their repertoire, but would be exciting for them to include.
Do we have other questions? Please feel free. Okay, well, we'll wind up then. We have some